Hello, I'm John Marks, Editorial Director of African Energy. And on this podcast, just running through basically what we had in our latest issue, number 439, believe it or not, is my colleague Dan Marks, who's the African Energy Power Editor. And we're just going to go through, discuss some of the issues that we've got in the book, and then lead you on to go and see more, both from the links that we provide with this podcast, but also, of course, in the book itself, which was quite substantial. So, hello, Dan. We opened on looking at the Sahel and the politics, the risk issues involved, but of course also linked in with the fact that it's been seen in recent times as quite a substantial opportunity for solar developers. How do you see the situation in that part of the world?
Well, it's a very difficult situation, I think, and a very interesting situation. I think it very much depends who you are in the energy sector industry. Obviously, for the governments, where the government has not changed or is not in the middle of a change, then the priorities are obvious, in terms of improving security, getting in as much investment as possible. Donors have been incredibly supportive. There are enormous programs across the region, and energy is a major focus. With lots, particularly for power, utility reform, sector reform, and especially IPPs and solar, particularly solar IPPs. I think if you are an investor, however, you've got to be asking some very difficult questions about where you will be doing business. I think obviously it's very different country to country, but obviously the big changes in Mali and Chad give a lot of food for thought. Chad in particular, there's been quite a lot of interest from some IPPs, from development and development-led IPPs as well. How well they will survive the current political changes is a big question. Mali has a bit of track record attracting IPPs and has signed a lot of agreements, but fundamentally, IPPs are going to have to ask themselves over a 25-year period, are they going to be able to get paid? Is the security situation going to allow them to get paid, even if governments want to, and the government's going to be able to enact the reforms that will be necessary? So it's all very well to want a lot of solar IPPs, but once there are a lot of IPPs with government guarantees or multilateral guarantees, I mean, that's a huge question at the moment. Governments are not really in a position to provide guarantees. Multilaterals are reluctant to provide guarantees. So where at some point these IPPs will need to be paid by the utility may not have cost-reflective tariffs. Reform's not happening fast enough. Are you willing to take that risk? I think that's still a huge question, no matter how much development money is there.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I particularly liked in the story and working with our cartographer was a very, very busy graphic mixing some of the flashpoints just over the last couple of months, and the international military deployments going on with some of the projects that have been going on at the same time. It seems to me it's a kind of situation where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It's very difficult. Moving on within the book, almost immediately we came on to that time of the year when African Energy Live Data produces its annual results, that is showing the trends in generation projects across the continent from the 6,500 plus projects that Live Data has. Now, I know, Dan, you've done a webinar separately to this, which we'd be delighted for people to link to. But what would you say were the top of the story analysis that you made from looking at all these projects over the last year?
Well, I think it will come as no surprise that it was a bad year for new capacity in Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa in particular, it's the lowest new net capacity additions since 2008. So a really bad year. I think the interesting thing is to dig a little bit beyond COVID-19 and see whether there are other factors as well at play. And 2019 was also not a particularly good year for new capacity in Africa. And I think also you can see this more anecdotally if you look at just the investment volumes into commercial and industrial developers across the continent, where investors are fed up with grid and lack of opportunities to invest in IPPs, and are now looking to sell directly to large customers who are also themselves desperate for power. So the continent seems to be at a bit of an inflection point. Different bits are moving at very different speeds. We're moving from a state-led, large baseload plant type scenario to a more diverse, smaller IPP, smarter grid type place. But the question really is it happening fast enough? In North Africa, in South Africa, the pace is pretty swift, and you can see how there are going to be huge amounts of investment into those regions in the coming years in private investment. But for sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of the smaller countries, there are real questions about, and actually especially a lot of the middle income type countries, the low middle income type countries, there's a lot of questions about whether reforms are happening fast enough and to support economic development into the future. So yeah, quite a lot of issues to dig into.
Is your glass for 2021-22 feeling rather half full, or are you in a half empty situation?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's hard to look at the pipeline and not have it half full. The pipeline for the continent is quite big. There's a fair number of projects that could be developed, and there's investors who are tearing their hair out for wanting to put money in, and you can hardly say that that's a bad situation to be in. In fact, it's a situation I think a lot of other continents would be desperate for. But I'm not completely optimistic that investors will be able to get their money in over the next couple of years in the quantities that are needed. I think there's still a lot of mindset and reform changes that still need to happen.
It's good. On reform, certainly an issue, and we're going to come back to that in just a second. I guess in the book, if you are looking for upsides, I'd go right to the back of the book. Emerging technologies could be transformational, but also disruptive. A wordplay on the transformational but disruptive technology play that everyone's so excited in at the moment. And that was in our AE View, the kind of editorial of the publication. It was a roundup more than, possibly less focused than sometimes, but inspired by our AIX event in the middle of last month, which was called "Which Technologies Can Drive Africa's Energy Transition?" And we were looking at this a bit from a technical point of view, but also very much as a policy thing, looking at how excited people should be about technologies and what they should be looking for. Clearly, we looked at hydrogen, which is an issue that African Energy has looked at before. We tend not to be as breathless as many people do about the apparent arrival of a hydrogen economy. That's going to cost many trillions of dollars to see, but certainly there are niches. What was really entertaining in the whole thing was the enthusiasm for different technologies and what they could do. For example, we even discussed, are we going to see use of tidal power, which would be fantastic, still to prove, Ghana's been among those looking at it. Floating solar, that really does have some fans, including, I have to say, myself. And is something we'll see a lot more. Also saves water as well as from evaporation, as well as generating electricity. We looked at pump storage, hydroelectricity as actually the largest existing still form of storage on the continent. And we looked at a number of other technologies. Geothermal got a good discussion going. And in geothermal, as with hydrogen, where the Moroccans came out and said, you know, we think we've got a business model that can make this work. People are coming up with new business models. Kenya is looking at green manufacturing using geothermal energy for industry. So basically, we went for a rattle around these subjects, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to them in our reporting of projects. Meanwhile, just before we leave what was, as always, a very busy power sector, we had two large stories in the power section, didn't we, Dan? One with your own byline on it, on South Africa confirms plans to procure 9.2 gigawatts over the next 8 months, which is a remarkable claim. And also from Chiwewe, our correspondent in Lusaka, we had a substantial piece on the continuing battles between the Zambian government and CEC. How do you see the takeaways from these stories?
Well, I think the Zambian story in particular is really important, and it does show where kind of reform fault lines can emerge, particularly between different groups of advisors and donors and things like that within countries. There's always potential for advice to split and people to back different reforms, and you can end up with a bit of a mess. And I think that's what we have. I think it's very damaging for Zambia, and it's all very hard to tell exactly what's going to happen before elections later this year. In South Africa, obviously, it's great that the country is moving ahead with procurement. Finally have bid window 5, which has been talked about since 2014, with new rules and things like that. There's a lot of legislative movement upstream, developments in the gas sector in particular, some shale as well being announced. Quite a lot of controversial things, shale not least amongst them, nuclear procurement, coal procurement. There'll be a lot of questions about whether any coal procurement will face legal challenges. It's not completely clear whether, even with coal power being decommissioned in the country, South Africa can actually bring on 1.5 gigawatts new coal capacity and meet its Paris climate agreement. So a lot of people may be looking at whether those procurements or projects will end up in court, again, like the previous coal projects.
Yes, indeed. It's yet another occasion for the learned friends to be making money, and in this case, in a conflictual context. Indeed, in the finance and policies section, we had the piece about the battle between the Angolan government and General Electric on one side, and Angolan registered company Energy on the other, over a battle over what the Angolan plaintiff claimed was breaches of contracts. That was thrown out by the US District Court for the Southern District of New York. Interesting point throughout this is that the electricity supply industry for a very long time has rather been seen as not as conflictual, not as confrontational, not as prone to governance issues as the other side that we do, the oil upstream and downstream and oil trading. And I feel that over time, that's changing, and we're going to see quite a lot more conflict. We're going to see people arguing over contracts, and these are issues that will be played out. We certainly see some of this stuff already, but it seems to be on the rise. Just to round it off, in the upstream section, we don't have our colleague James Gavin with us this week, but I'm sure he'll be with us soon. But James also looked at those developments in South Africa that Dan was looking at from the perspective of the Upstream Petroleum Resources Development Bill, which is due to come to Parliament. And I think upstream players are going to be looking at with great interest, particularly as around that southern cone of Africa, the potentials for more gas to be found come up. You know, we have all the situations around Brulpadda and Rupert, the discoveries in the Utenica Basin, and there's a growing interest. One of the companies that James talked to for this issue was Impact Oil and Gas, who just farmed into offshore South Africa, and they're also involved in Namibia, a place that people are again looking at quite a lot after a long period. One of our more recent issues, we had an analysis of whether Namibia and people are looking. I think that there won't be many offshore wells to be spudded in the second half of this year that will be as widely observed as Total's Venus 1X well that's going to go be drilled offshore Namibia. We also looked at declining production in Equatorial Guinea and where it was going. Companies reaffirming their commitments to Algeria, but only so far through memoranda of understanding and not firmer deals. I think what we're going to be seeing very much is this question over the next few months with the oil majors, even Exxon, as we've seen from the shareholder activity over the last week, is being forced to look again at the energy transition. Other companies, Total, which only today changed its name to reflect that transition, BP, Shell, all changing their positions. And I think those corporate changes in the kind of the many countries that African Energy covers in its upstream, they're all big issues to come out. The final story I'd like to point to was actually in the downstream section and looked at Egypt's plans to achieve self-sufficiency in refined products. And our colleague John Hamilton's been looking at this, talking to people as in his inimitable way. And he has come out with a very interesting observation that the Egyptian energy authorities, led by that forceful player, Tariq al-Mullah, the petroleum minister, are looking again at oil, because they've actually worked out that having done very well producing gas, that actually what's needed now is possibly some more oil production to feed this growing industry. So that's one to look out for. Also in Egypt, we had a look at the consequences of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and the way that Egypt had stepped in to try and help to reach the ceasefire that happened in Gaza, but also to benefit from a position by leveraging its diplomatic muscle to gain favor in Washington, where after all, the Biden administration is not nearly as favorable to Cairo as the Trump was, but also to look to possible new deals with Egypt. So we had a look at that. The other story in the downstream was, of course, the good news from the African energy investment community, that the Romco pipeline, Sasol's 30% shares was going to a consortium of retail group and the private equity fund manager, AIM, who we all know very well. That's a good news story to wrap up for this week if we're looking for some investment plays that could really have some benefits for the whole industry and keeping economies right the way across the continent afloat.